The year was 1206, and across the endless steppes of Mongolia, Genghis Khan was about to institutionalize a wedding tradition so brutal that it would terrorize women across 3 continents for the next 3 centuries. What you're about to hear is the shocking truth about Mongol marriage customs, practices so violent and degrading that they make modern accounts of historical brutality seem tame. This is the story of how the world's largest empire was built on the systematic abduction and abuse of women, and why these traditions were deliberately hidden from historical records. This wasn't just about individual crimes or isolated incidents of violence. This was a carefully organized social system that turned marriage into military conquest, where young women were hunted like animals, where virginity was proven through public torture, and where rape was not just accepted, but actually required as part of the wedding ceremony. The Mongols had weaponized marriage itself as a tool of cultural domination. Picture the Mongol Empire at its height, stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But behind the military victories and political achievements lay a social system so horrifying that even medieval chroniclers, who were accustomed to violence, struggled to describe what they witnessed. The wedding traditions that Genghis Khan codified were based on ancient steppe customs, but he systematized them into official imperial policy. Marriage among the Mongols wasn't about love or even family alliances. It was about demonstrating male dominance through the conquest and subjugation of women. Every wedding was essentially a ritualized act of warfare against the bride. The process began with what the Mongols called bride hunting. Young Mongol warriors would organize raids specifically to capture women from neighboring tribes or conquered peoples. These weren't random attacks, but carefully planned operations that targeted communities known to have young, unmarried women. The raids were considered training exercises that prepared warriors for actual military campaigns. But the most disturbing aspect was that resistance during capture was not just expected, but encouraged. Mongol men believed that a woman who didn't fight back wasn't worthy of marriage. The struggle itself was considered an essential part of the courtship process. Women who submitted too easily were often rejected as potential wives and sold into slavery instead. The captured women were brought back to Mongol camps where they faced what can only be described as a public ordeal designed to break their spirits. They were stripped, examined, and subjected to purity tests that were essentially ritualized sexual assault. These examinations were conducted in front of the entire tribe, with detailed commentary on the woman's physical condition and estimated value as a wife. The virginity verification process was particularly brutal. Mongol shamans would use sharp instruments to physically examine women, causing deliberate pain and injury that was believed to reveal their sexual history. Women who were found to be impure faced immediate execution or enslavement, while those who passed the examination were marked with symbols that indicated their approved status. But surviving the purity test was only the beginning of the ordeal. Approved brides then faced a period called breaking, during which they were systematically abused to eliminate any remaining independence or resistance. This wasn't just physical violence, but psychological warfare designed to transform proud women into completely submissive slaves. The wedding ceremony itself was the culmination of months of abuse. The bride was dressed in special garments that emphasized her captive status, bound with ropes that prevented any possibility of escape, and presented to the groom in a ritual that celebrated her complete surrender. The ceremony wasn't about joining 2 people in marriage, but about formally transferring ownership of a conquered woman. What followed was what Mongol culture euphemistically called the wedding night, but which was actually institutionalized rape conducted according to specific traditions. The consummation had to be performed in front of witnesses who would testify that the marriage had been properly completed. Privacy was considered weakness that might allow the bride to maintain some dignity or independence. The most shocking aspect of these traditions was how they were exported throughout the Mongol Empire. As Mongol armies conquered new territories, they imposed their marriage customs on subject populations. Local women who had lived under completely different cultural systems suddenly found themselves subject to Mongol wedding traditions that treated them as property to be captured and conquered. Chinese, Persian, Russian, and European communities under Mongol rule were forced to adapt to marriage systems that violated everything they believed about human dignity and family relationships. Traditional wedding ceremonies that had celebrated love and partnership were replaced by Mongol rituals that emphasized domination and abuse. The psychological impact on women throughout the empire was devastating. Entire generations grew up knowing that marriage meant abduction, torture, and rape. Young girls lived in constant fear of being selected for bride hunting raids. Families would go to extraordinary lengths to hide their daughters or arrange hasty marriages to men who might offer some protection. But perhaps the most disturbing element was how these practices were justified through Mongol religious beliefs. Shamans taught that women were naturally rebellious and needed to be tamed through violence before they could fulfill their proper roles as wives and mothers. The abuse wasn't seen as cruelty but as necessary spiritual discipline that prepared women for marriage. The economic dimensions of the system were equally horrifying. Women became commodities that could be traded, sold, or given as gifts between Mongol nobles. Their value was determined by their age, appearance, and the amount of resistance they had shown during capture. A woman who had fought particularly hard was considered more valuable because her eventual submission demonstrated the captor's superior strength. The breeding programs that emerged from these traditions were designed to produce children with specific characteristics that the Mongols valued. Women from different ethnic groups were systematically paired with Mongol men to create mixed populations that combined local knowledge with Mongol loyalty. This wasn't just cultural assimilation, but genetic manipulation on an imperial scale. Record-keeping of these practices was deliberately minimal. The Mongols understood that their marriage customs would be viewed as barbaric by many of their subjects. Official chronicles emphasized military victories and administrative achievements, while minimizing references to the systematic abuse of women. The full horror of Mongol wedding traditions was hidden from historical documentation. The few detailed accounts that survive come from foreign observers who were shocked by what they witnessed. Persian historians describe Mongol marriage customs as evidence of demonic possession. Chinese scholars wrote about the beast-like behavior of their conquerors. European chroniclers struggled to find words adequate to describe practices that exceeded their understanding of human cruelty. One particularly detailed account comes from the Persian historian Giovanni, who witnessed a mass wedding ceremony involving over 200 captured women. He described the systematic abuse as resembling the slaughter of sheep, with Mongol warriors competing to see who could inflict the most pain while maintaining the pretense of marriage ritual. The resistance movements that emerged in response to Mongol marriage customs were often led by women who had escaped the system. These underground networks would help young girls flee before they could be captured, provide safe houses for women who had managed to escape from Mongol marriages, and sometimes organize armed resistance against bride hunting raids. But the most effective resistance came from within Mongol society itself. Some Mongol women who had achieved positions of influence, particularly the wives and mothers of Khans, began quietly working to modify the worst aspects of the marriage traditions. They couldn't eliminate the system entirely without challenging fundamental cultural beliefs, but they could sometimes limit its excesses. The gradual decline of these practices began when the Mongol Empire started fragmenting in the 13th century. Local rulers who had been forced to adopt Mongol customs began returning to their traditional marriage practices. Chinese, Persian, and other cultures that had maintained underground preservation of their original traditions started reasserting their values. The conversion of many Mongol rulers to Buddhism, Christianity, or Islam also contributed to the modification of marriage customs. Religious authorities from these faiths condemned the most brutal aspects of Mongol wedding traditions, providing theological justification for reforms that local populations desperately wanted. But the complete elimination of Mongol-influenced marriage practices took centuries. Even after the empire's political collapse, many communities continued following modified versions of the traditions. The psychological and cultural damage had been so severe that normal marriage customs took generations to re-establish. Modern analysis of genetic evidence has revealed the staggering scope of the Mongol marriage system's impact. Genetic markers associated with Mongol ancestry appear in populations throughout Asia and Eastern Europe at frequencies that suggest systematic interbreeding on a massive scale. Millions of people today carry genetic evidence of ancestors who were victims of the Mongol marriage system. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the former Mongol Empire has uncovered mass graves containing the remains of women who showed signs of systematic abuse before death. These discoveries suggest that the mortality rate among captured brides was extremely high, and that many women preferred death to submission to Mongol marriage customs. The deliberate destruction of records documenting these practices has made it difficult for modern historians to fully understand their scope and impact. Mongol authorities apparently made systematic efforts to eliminate evidence of the most brutal aspects of their marriage traditions, recognizing that such documentation could be used to justify rebellion or foreign intervention. Contemporary attempts to discuss these historical realities face significant political and cultural sensitivities. Governments in regions with significant Mongol heritage populations often discourage research that might reflect negatively on their ancestors, while academic institutions worry about the implications of studying systematized sexual violence. But understanding the full horror of Mongol marriage customs is essential for comprehending how imperial expansion affected women throughout history. The Mongol system represented one of the most organized and extensive programs of gender-based violence in recorded history, affecting millions of women across multiple continents over several centuries. The psychological techniques that the Mongols developed for breaking women's resistance influenced later systems of oppression throughout the regions they controlled. Many of the methods they pioneered for psychological domination would reappear in other contexts, creating patterns of abuse that persisted long after the empire's collapse. The legacy of these practices can be traced in folk traditions, marriage customs, and cultural attitudes toward women that persist in some regions today. The normalization of violence against women that the Mongol system created had lasting effects that continue to influence social relationships centuries after the empire's fall. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this history is how completely it was erased from popular understanding of the Mongol Empire. Most people today know about Mongol military victories, administrative innovations, and cultural exchanges, but remain ignorant of the systematic abuse that formed the foundation of Mongol social organization. This selective historical memory reflects broader patterns of how societies choose to remember or forget uncomfortable truths about their past. The same mechanisms that allowed Mongol marriage traditions to be hidden from historical records continue to operate today, ensuring that the most disturbing aspects of human behavior remain invisible to casual examination. The next time you read about the achievements of historical empires, remember the women whose suffering was deliberately erased from those accounts, because understanding the full cost of imperial expansion requires acknowledging the systematic violence that made such achievements possible. If stories about the hidden horrors of historical systems and their lasting impact on human society fascinate you, subscribe to The Grey Hour for more investigations into the truths that powerful institutions prefer to keep buried, because sometimes the most important history is the history that no one wants to remember.